If the approach will be strong negotiation from the Russian side, I do think that that will put pressure on the relationship with the U.S. And ultimately, President Trump likes to win negotiations and, importantly, be seen to winning negotiations.
So Keir Starmer says Russia's President Vladimir Putin should not be allowed to play games with President Trump's proposed ceasefire deal. The Prime Minister is hosting a virtual summit with world leaders later today. He's expected to push for more military support for Ukraine and to keep the economic pressure on Russia to force Putin into negotiations. Well, Sir Richard Sheriff is the former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. He told us Donald Trump has backed himself into a corner and the only way forward will be to cooperate with America's European allies.
The only position of strength that America would have, as I say, is if they had put together a strategy, together with their European and other Western allies, to give Ukraine the means to defeat Russia, to absolutely inflict defeat. And the only way that Russia is going to accept some sort of peace is if they are stopped and given a serious bloody nose. The only way you're going to get a peacekeeping force in there is to force it on Russia, because Russia's already said we're not prepared to accept Western peacekeepers.
Well, that's Sir Richard Sheriff there, who's former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. Let's speak now to Michael Martins, who served as the US Embassy's person in Westminster during Trump's first term. Good morning to you.
Nice to see you again.
Probably best to start really with a response to that claim there, that Trump has effectively backed himself into a corner. Do you agree with that?
Actually, I don't really, because I think there's a bit of daylight that we're starting to see between President Trump, the man at the top, and some of the machinery of government. Like if you read through the G7 communique that came out recently, it's actually kind of putting out some of the more stronger U.S. government terms for what they want to see in a ceasefire. And at the very bottom, it talks about Ukraine as like the future of Ukraine, where it's democratic, free, strong, independent. Like these are relatively vague, but I think the direction of travel is clear. And I think some of the U.S. government overall is starting to also influence what the ceasefire will look like, not just President Trump on Truth Social.
One of the criticisms of Donald Trump by people in Europe kind of observing what's going on is they see that Trump is publicly very critical of Ukraine. He's not publicly critical of Putin. And there's a fear that Trump will effectively give Putin exactly what he wants. In light of what you've just said, do you disagree with that?
I do a bit, because I think we haven't necessarily seen the next stage of this, which is getting Russia to the table. We're starting to see it, and we're already starting to see some of the delays that Putin will probably try and do, which also explains why he's trying really hard to get back Kursk. So there's less of an ability for conditionality for land swaps between Russia and Ukraine. So I think the longer the longer Putin takes, like the more pressure it'll put on his relationship with President Trump. But also at the same time, it does give a bit of time for Starmer and Macron to continue building their coalition of the willing and fleshing out what that will look like in a ceasefire, and whether that means Western troops in Ukraine or not, and the like. So I think there's a bit of nuance to the debate so far.
There were reports last night suggesting that Putin kept the US envoy Steve Witkoff waiting for 8 hours for that meeting in Moscow on Thursday night. Then, of course, they sent him, the Russian administration sent Witkoff back to Trump, not agreeing to a ceasefire deal, but effectively with a list of demands. How will Trump respond to that? Will he respect that, or will it annoy him?
I think probably a mixture of both. I think it's a strong start, and if you look at obviously like the differences between that and the Zelensky press conference, like I think this one it's less in the public eye. It's a bit more controlled in terms of how any possible spillovers might happen. I don't think President Trump is going to take it, arms open, hugging the idea of it. I think, it's a negotiation tactic, and we're going to start to see that. And if the approach will be strong negotiation from the Russian side, I do think that will put pressure on the relationship with the U.S. And ultimately, President Trump likes to win negotiations and, importantly, be seen to winning negotiations. So if there's this idea of making his envoy wait for 8 hours, as a first foray. If that direction of travel continues, I can see President Trump becoming a bit annoyed about that.
And that's what I wondered, where the line is where you can antagonise Trump, where it goes from respect to antagonism, because, I mean, it very much looks from the outside, and clearly we don't know what conversations going on behind the scenes, but from the outside it looks like Trump is kind of more towards Putin than he is towards Zelensky at the moment. If Putin starts pushing his luck, dragging this out, making Trump look like he's not able to close a deal as easily as he likes to tell everyone he can, could Trump turn on Putin?
Well, I've been saying this for a while. I think the interesting thing is Putin doesn't have a plan B. Like, I think in many ways he's gone all in on the idea of President Trump winning a second term, because that in his mind advances his interests, at least relative to President Biden, right? So in practical terms, I actually think President Trump has the most leverage over Russia. And I think we might find out what that line is, the threshold. But, if that threshold is crossed, we already saw the U.S. restore intelligence sharing, military aid, and the like to Ukraine almost overnight once President Zelensky had signed up to President Trump's at least vision for this. And I think that same sort of approach of getting, in this case, the Russian side to the negotiation table, it will have an effect on Russia. And I don't necessarily think that they will be as cooperative as President Zelensky has been over the past week and a bit.
Finally, you mentioned there about Trump likes to show that he can make a deal, that he is successful. Is there a danger that Trump could walk away and say, look, if this goes on for months, I'm not interested, I want to focus on something else, and just leave the situation altogether?
There's always that danger. And I think for any credible party in a negotiation, the credibility stems from the idea of being able to walk away. And I think, President Trump's a credible actor in that sense. I think the key question is, who is the reason why he would be walking away? And is it because, Russia is taking ages to come to the table and is coming up with continued demands and the like? And I think that's a completely different story than if it was, President Zelensky doing X, Y, or Z. And I think that we've actually now entered the different stage of this negotiation where it's like, okay, we are going to see whether or not Russia comes to the table, and importantly, like what their side will want in this and how that will align with President Trump. And more importantly, I think we're starting to also see the machinery of the U.S. government involving itself in the negotiations and how that aligns with the U.S. government's interests and what it wants out of this ceasefire.
Michael, it's been fascinating to speak to you this morning. Your insight is really valuable. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
That's Michael Martins. He served as the US Embassy's person in Westminster during Trump's first term. I think that's really interesting, that point that Michael makes there, that Putin doesn't have a plan B. Yeah. If he annoys Trump to such a point that it looks like Trump is not going to get the deal he wants, there is a danger Trump could walk away. There is a danger that Putin antagonises Trump. And therefore, it's important that Trump is strong. Yeah. It's also important that Putin doesn't push his luck.
Yeah, and he doesn't have all the cards, is the other thing for Putin. There are things up for grabs when it comes to his own position.
Who's got the cards?
Who does have...
Sorry, I'm relating, obviously, of course, to what Donald Trump said to Zelensky in the Oval
Where
Office.
are the cards? Whose court is the ball in? That's another phrase we're hearing a lot of over the course of this weekend as well.